is based on personal experience read incorrectly into who he is. A second reason that I think this topic can be useful is that this is a significant topic. If you look at how often this concept comes up in the scriptures, it's there from beginning to end, or if you see how many other significant topics tie in with this topic, the frequency that we have there and the connection that it has with other things suggests that this is a topic worth spending some time focusing on. Third reason that I think this topic can be useful is just because of how practical it is. What we do in life is significantly connected with who we believe God is. If we believe that God is some dotingly indulgent grandfather figure up in the sky, we'll act differently. Or if we think that God is this vindictive despot waiting to strike us the first time that we err, we'll act differently. What a Muslim thinks is true about God is different, and the Muslim acts differently as a result. We want to think about God as he is, as he's revealed himself to be, and then live our lives accordingly. And so this topic can help us in that regard. In terms of framing the things that we'll look at together this morning, a few things that are worth mentioning is first some academic terms that might help explain how we look at an approach here. First, some of you are probably familiar with the term systematic theology. This is a fairly common term. The idea of systematic theology in terms of how it approaches the Bible focuses on things such as what are the conclusions that we can distill out of the truth throughout the scriptures, and what are the questions that we often have, and can we come to the Bible and get answers on these important questions that we have. And there's not to say that there's anything wrong with doing such a thing. The Bible is true from beginning to end, and because it's true from beginning to end, it is consistent with itself, and seeing that consistency is a useful thing. Or the Bible does have answers to important questions, and we can go and find those answers there. Another approach, though, that may be a little bit less familiar and will be relevant to how we look at things this morning is what's called biblical theology. This term can be a little bit confusing because it almost sounds like, oh, well, this is biblical theology, and so anything else must be unbiblical theology. That isn't the meaning here, but more the idea is that systematic theology is about taking the truths of God and seeing a system built out of them, whereas biblical theology is more seeing the truths of God as they lie in the text. And so focusing on things like what does the text have to say in context rather than going to what are the conclusions that we reach in terms of how everything fits together immediately. Or what is the progress of revelation? What is God saying here that hadn't been said before? Or what point of time in history are we? A little bit more of just a different emphasis and focus. And so this morning we'll take an approach that's more along the lines of biblical theology, specifically seeing what are some of the themes of biblical theology, in this case Father and Son, in tracing those through from Genesis to Revelation and seeing how those ideas develop over time in what we learn as God reveals more about himself. Another piece of context that's worth considering as we look at this topic is the ideas of Father and Son and how we use them in modern English can be a bit different from what we'll see in the scriptures. For example, when you use the word Father or you use the word Son, you probably have something in mind like the immediate male physical ancestor or descendant. That's the common English use of the term. But when we see the use in Scripture, it's a little bit different than that sometimes. So for example, if we look at Genesis 28:13, and behold, Yahweh stood above it and said, I am Yahweh, the God of your father Abraham and the God of Isaac. The land on which you lie, I will give it to you and to your descendants. Or in Genesis 32:9, Jacob said, O God of my father Abraham and God of my father Isaac, O Yahweh, who said to me, return to your country and to your relatives, and I will prosper you. This isn't the way we would usually refer to things in English. We would have said that, well, there's this Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and so when Jacob's talking, he would talk about his grandfather Abraham and his father Isaac. Whereas the term's used a little bit differently in Scripture, it's just father. That's the term for any ancestor, no matter how distant. Or similarly in Exodus 1:7, perhaps between the time that the people go down to Egypt and then come back is around 420 years from the time that Jacob has first been there. But we hear the term for Jacob or Israel, his sons, But the sons of Israel were fruitful and increased and multiplied and became exceedingly mighty so that the land was filled with them. So this can be hundreds of years later. We're talking about Israel's sons, though Israel's been dead quite a while. Again, the scriptures are just comfortable using the term son to refer to generations distant. It isn't about just that immediate 1 degree of relationship, father to son, not separate terms for grandfather, grandson, things like that. Another thing that's worth considering here is that the terms aren't always used even about descent at all. So if we look at Mark 3:17, for example, we see that Jesus gives James and John, the sons of Zebedee, basically a nickname, which means sons of thunder. Not to mean that thunder is somehow their physical father, but to say that they carry a family resemblance to thunder in their actions. You want to understand why they act that way? They're sons of thunder. And that explains a little bit about who they are in terms of how they act. Or similarly, in John chapter 8, we have Jesus speaking to the Jews. They answered and said to him, "Abraham is our father." Jesus said to them, "If you were Abraham's children, you would do the deeds of Abraham, but now you are seeking to kill me, a man who has told you the truth, which I heard from God. This Abraham did not do. You are doing the deeds of your father." They said to him, "We were not born of sexual immorality. We have one Father, God." Jesus said to them, "If God were your father, you would love me, for I proceeded forth and have come from God. For I have not even come of myself, but he sent me. Why do you not understand what I am saying? It is because you cannot hear my word. You are of your father, the devil, and you want to do the desires of your father. He was a murderer from the beginning and does not stand in the truth because there is no truth in him. Whenever he speaks a lie, he speaks from his own nature, for he is a liar and the father of lies." So here we see a use of the term father and son that doesn't have to do anything with physical ancestry, but instead about actions, about the family resemblance. How do your deeds match who your father is, so to speak, rather than who is your immediate biological parent? One other thing to consider in terms of background here is that it's easy to have our understanding a little bit upside down in terms of God and fatherhood and our own experience. It's easy to see that we experience earthly fatherhood first and then potentially could read into what God is, our own experiences there. But we should see that it's a little bit the other way around in terms of what is definitive, that earthly fatherhood is actually a reflection of what it is that God is, who he is. And so that it isn't the case that God is just a greater version of an earthly father here, that no earthly fatherhood reflects God, and that is the definitive foundational understanding that we should have. You can imagine, for example, if someone spent his whole life in a cave and first comes out at night and sees the moon, and then is told that there is this thing called a sun and thinks, oh, well, the sun is a greater version of the moon. And that's not it at all. The light of the moon reflects the light of the sun. And if you think that the sun is just a greater version of the moon, you're going to be greatly mistaken. You've got it a bit backwards. And I think to a certain extent, this reflects our own experience in that when we come into the world, our first experience with father and son is the earthly fatherhood and sonship that we have. But we don't want to misunderstand that as the authoritative, definitive, what father and son is, and see God as just a greater version than that. What the scriptures present is a little bit different. So in terms of an overview of what we'll look at this morning, we'll sort of go Genesis to Revelation, looking at the topic of father and son. And so starting with Adam and Seth, moving on to the time of Job and Abraham, looking at the period of the Exodus, looking at David, what is said in the Psalms and then the prophets as we head towards a time of captivity and exile. And then finally in the New Testament, going all the way up through what we see about Jesus. So, father and son in the Old Testament. We'll start right at the beginning here, which is in Genesis 1. And so if you, feel free to turn there if you wish, Genesis 1 starting in verse 26. Then God said, "Let us make man in our image, according to our likeness, and let them rule over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the sky, and over the cattle, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth." God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him. Male and female he created them. God blessed them, and God said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it, and rule over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the sky and over every living thing that moves on the earth." Then God said, behold, I have given you every plant yielding seed that is on the surface of all the earth, and every tree which has fruit yielding seed. It shall be food for you, and to every beast of the earth, and to every bird of the sky, and to everything that moves on the earth which has life. I have given every green plant for food. And it was so. God saw all that he had made, and behold, it was very good. And there was evening, and there was morning, the sixth day. It's worth seeing here a couple of things. One is that, is there any term father or son in this text? No, it's just not there. At the same time, though, does that mean this text is not relevant for what we see in terms of father and son? No, we'll see later connections coming back again and again to some of the ideas developed here. And so just a few things worth emphasizing as, right here at the beginning, some foundational understanding that we can refer back to later. One is the idea of the image of God. This is there front and center in this text, that this is who man is, created in the image of God. We see later in Genesis that Yahweh God forms Adam out of the dust of the ground, breathes into his nostrils the breath of life, and man becomes a living soul. And so God's personal formation of Adam, his direct involvement in Adam coming into being. And then also, perhaps a little bit more frequently than I might have expected in this text, you see the concept of rule and dominion. Not necessarily something that we always remember, but they're somewhat front and center in the text is the idea that God, who has created and owns everything, is putting man in a position of having dominion over these things and having rule. There's also somewhat of a secondary theme that we'll see in a few places connected here, which is the theme of gift. And so God giving plants for food, and this is a theme that will come up again. So just a few things here that are sort of foundational understanding that we'll be able to refer back to as we see other passages on this topic. Then moving not that far forward on to Genesis 5, some of the early use of father and son. This is the book of the generations of Adam. In the day when God created man, he made him in the likeness of God. He created them male and female, and he blessed them and named them man in the day when they were created. When Adam had lived 130 years, he became the father of a son in his own likeness, according to his image, and named him Seth. So any thoughts here on what we're seeing about father and son and how that connects back to what we had seen in Genesis 1? Yes?
Looks like it's going to be a replicated thing that each will reflect the image of God in this beginning.
Yeah, absolutely. The image of God doesn't end with Adam, that God creates Adam in his image, and then Adam has a son in his image, and that image of God continues on down the line. Absolutely. Any other thoughts here? Yeah?
Well, and probably everybody knows this, but when it speaks to being made in our image, that's the first reference to the Trinity in the Bible, as I understand it, and that's quite extraordinary, I think. Maybe not exactly on topic, but I thought it was something.
Yeah, there's a hint in the plurality there that maybe there's something more beneath the surface.
Well, I think it's definitely. I think it's just hinted at. Naming,
yeah. Do you want to say more on that?
Just that there seems to be some authority that's already described in that God names Adam, and then Adam names his children likewise.
Yeah. We're seeing some parallelism that seems to be intentionally established, that what God is with respect to Adam, Adam is with respect to his son. And though it doesn't quite spell it out, there's some hints there that there's some symmetry in those relationships. Yeah. So moving on to just a little bit later, we start to see a term that I think comes up for the first time in the Bible here, which is a bit of a different use. So in Genesis chapter 6, now it came about when men began to multiply on the face of the land, and daughters were born to them, that the sons of God saw that the daughters of men were beautiful, and they took wives for themselves whomever they chose. Then Yahweh said, my spirit shall not strive with man forever, because he also is flesh. Nevertheless, his days shall be 120 years. The Nephilim were on earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God came into the daughters of men, and they bore children to them. Those were the mighty men who were of old, men of renown. This one is a little bit of a puzzling passage because we're not told a whole lot of who these sons of God are here. We just have the phrase used, and there isn't a ton more to go on. And so it helps to look forward a little bit into the other places this term is used, which, if we follow the timeline of the Bible chronologically, Job would be about somewhere perhaps around the time of Abraham, and so move a little bit forward and see how this terminology shows up there. And so in Job chapter 1, for example, we see, now there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before Yahweh, and Satan also came among them. And God and Satan talk about Job, and God says that he's upright and so on. And so there we get a much clearer idea of who these sons of God are, in that these are people coming to God where he is. This doesn't seem like it could be humans here, right, entering into the presence of God, and Satan coming among them. Okay, so I think we're talking more about spiritual beings, angels here. Or the same thing that we see also in Job chapter 2. Again, there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before Yahweh, and Satan also came among them to present himself before Yahweh, and another conversation develops. Or similarly, in Job chapter 38, God is speaking and says, where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding. Who set its measurements, since you know? Or who stretched the line on it? On what were its bases sunk? Or who laid its cornerstone? When the morning stars sang together, and all the sons of God shouted for joy. This also seems here to be a pretty clear reference to angels that would be there in rejoicing, seeing God's work in creation. And so it's worth then considering here any idea why we would hear the phrase sons of God used to refer to angels. What is there about angels that would make such a term appropriate? Any ideas? They're created beings. God is their source, so they come from God, and there's a relationship there. Yeah.
Being, it was somebody that looked more like a man than a beast.
Yeah, they're able to take on human form as we see in the Bible, which is a reflection of the image of God itself. Yeah.
Well, God's Father is all, so created all, so he owns it all, but then anything created by him is the descendant.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
God as, I think
the angels obviously are descended from God. He created them properly, but then some of them were corrupted, and those are the sons of God that I think we're talking about here.
Yeah, no, I think we see that as God is the source, he is the creator. Those who come from him, we see that kind of relationship. Yeah. No, the image of God is specifically mentioned with relation to man. So there's a difference there. And so that, yeah, they're ministering spirits sent to minister for the sake of those who will inherit eternal life. And so it is worth understanding here that when we look at father and son in the Bible, is every use meaning the exact same thing? So if Adam fathers a son, Seth, do we mean the exact same thing when we see that angels are referred to as sons of God? Well, no, this is a bit of a different usage, and so we shouldn't flatten this all out and think that the terms mean the same thing everywhere, but sort of see a bit of a distinct meaning. Yeah.
Of the antinomy of the Trinity. There's the Father, and there's the Son, and the Holy Spirit, but they're all equal, and one doesn't really beget the other. In other words, in some sort of temporal or lineal sense. They're all one, and yet they're three distinct persons with their own unique agencies and fulfillment of their roles. But I think that we sometimes think of that God is the dad, and then he creates Christ, and you can look at it in a simplistic way, and that's incorrect.
Yeah, we don't want to overread into the terms here that, oh, well, if angels are referred to as sons of God, that means that there's some equality with God here. That would be a misunderstanding. I think a couple of other things that are worth seeing here are that angels are spiritual beings, and so there's something they reflect about God. God is the Father of spirits, and these are some of the spirits that he has created. Or that angels are majestic beings, and so there's something they reflect about God's power and majesty, where this seems to hint at why they would be referred to in this kind of way. But again, this is a different thing than we would see elsewhere in the scriptures in terms of how the terms Father and Son are used. Sure.
Pre-incarnate Christ.
Yeah.
And so that's another subtlety about angels.
Yeah, there's a link there between angels and
Christ,
another kind of son. Yeah. Yeah.
Are fallen angels,
Yes, it is.
because in Jude 6, I believe it says here, the angels did not keep, angels who did not keep their own domain, but abandoned their proper abode. And I think this is referring to those same ones.
Yeah, there were angels who didn't do that they were supposed to do, and I think you see that here in Genesis. Yeah. The boundary. Yeah, definitely. Moving forward then in history sort of to, or maybe around the same time actually, but in the text in Genesis, to Genesis chapter 15, we see another use of Father and Son, or at least these ideas. So Genesis 15, starting in verse 1, after these things the word of Yahweh came to Abram in a vision, saying, "Do not fear, Abram, I am a shield to you, your reward shall be very great." Abram said, "O Lord Yahweh, what will you give me since I am childless? And the heir of my house is Eliezer of Damascus." And Abram said, "Since you have given no offspring to me, one born in my house is my heir." Then behold, the word of Yahweh came to him, saying, "This man will not be your heir, but one who will come forth from your own body, he shall be your heir." And he took him outside and said, "Now look toward the heavens and count the stars, if you are able to count them." And he said to him, "So shall your descendants be." Then he believed in Yahweh, and he reckoned it to him as righteousness. So a few things worth noting here is the connection between having a son and having an heir, that the normal way that an inheritance works is your sons inherit. But Abram has no son, and so who his heir will be is somebody else, and the text makes a significant point of this, right? And God says, no, this servant that you have isn't going to be your heir. You're going to have, it doesn't use the word here, but a son who will be your heir. So that's the idea that there is a son who is promised to come who will inherit. Those are some things that we may see come up again later in the scriptures on this topic. We move forward then to Genesis chapter 17 and see, starting in verse 4, "As for me, behold, my covenant is with you, and you will be the father of a multitude of nations. No longer shall your name be called Abram, but your name shall be Abraham, for I have made you the father of a multitude of nations. I will make you exceedingly fruitful, and I will make nations of you, and kings will come forth from you. I will establish my covenant between me and you and your descendants after you throughout their generations for an everlasting covenant, to be God to you and to your descendants after you." So what are some things that we see connected with the idea of father and son in the case of Abraham here? What else sort of comes along with it as part of the package? Yes.
A long way off, so.
The promise is not just to him, but for this offspring, this one to come.
And he's also promising Abraham that he will have descendants.
Yes.
Because he hasn't had, he's 99 years old before he has his son.
Yeah, there's a promise of a son and a promise to a son kind of at the same time here. Yeah.
Well, how extraordinary to be blessed by God and the bounty that comes.
Yeah.
To have his favor. It's just incredible.
And this blessing seems to be something appropriate to the blessing in father and son. There's something that seems to go together with blessing and protection, and these things don't seem disconnected entirely. Yeah.
He's also talking about the covenant. So
Yes.
it's a special bond that God's making a promise that he will not transgress.
Yeah, and so this covenant is with Abraham and his offspring, but not with the rest of the whole world, i.e., just because God is Father with respect to angels doesn't mean it's the same thing as for God to be Father with respect to creation, or the relationship that he has with Abraham is not the same as the relationship that he has with everyone else. Not all these uses will be the same. It's also worth noting here the idea of nations and kings sort of being introduced as another theme, and we'll see more on that shortly. And then in Genesis 18:10, it gets a little bit more specific in terminology, where Sarah, your wife, will have a son. No ambiguity left now that there is a promised son to come, and this is part of what God is going to do with Abraham. So now moving forward a bit in time to Exodus, starting in chapter 4, we see yet a different use. So Exodus chapter 4, starting in verse 21, Yahweh said to Moses, when you go back to Egypt, see that you perform before Pharaoh all the wonders which I have put in your power, but I will harden his heart so that he will not let the people go. Then you shall say to Pharaoh, thus says Yahweh, Israel is my son, my firstborn. So I said to you, let my son go, that he may serve me, but you have refused to let him go. Behold, I will kill your son, your firstborn. So what do we see here about how the word son is used in this case?
Well, sort of after that covenant that God gave to Abraham, now he's putting this down as his descendants as part of that covenant. That he said that these are essentially my most precious firstborn of the family. And the firstborn, historically in that time frame, is firstborn inherited the 2/3 of everything, while the rest of his sons inherited just a smaller portion. Yeah. So this is sort of his apple of his eye. It's important to him, and he wants to make sure that if Egypt does not listen to what he says, and he says he's going to harden his heart, Pharaoh, then he's going to deal with him.
Yeah. So the relationship that God has to his people here is different from his relationship to others. That there is my son, my firstborn, there is some love and particular care towards this one that isn't the same for everyone else, and I think that comes through clearly in the text here. Yeah.
When I first saw these, and I'm a sort of intermediate level believer, maybe 3 years in the faith or so, as I look at things like this, I always thought, well, why did God harden Pharaoh's heart? Why didn't he soften Pharaoh's heart? Why didn't he welcome Pharaoh in, to be aware of God and to realize that God was his Lord? And yet he didn't. And this is kind of like Job, where he puzzled over why things were happening to him. And I guess it was just in God's infinite wisdom that he did it this way. But I always thought this was kind of an interesting passage.
Yeah,
there are a lot of people that aren't Christians think, yeah, why isn't everybody just invited in? There's the elect. And so not everyone is going to be called. That doesn't seem fair,
Yeah.
And those kind of issues creep in here. I just felt like put that as an aside.
Yeah, this touches on other topics that are addressed later in the scriptures, but it doesn't give an answer right here for why it is that God does this. We see something about son and the connection that God is making here, but it doesn't answer that question right here. Yeah, sure.
David, would you work out the difference between firstborn, Israel, my son, my firstborn, and the last line there, I will kill your son, your firstborn. The firstborn there has a different context. Can you help us with that?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it's worth saying that similarly to son having slightly different uses, there's a little bit of perhaps you'd say a play on words with the term firstborn as well, where it isn't like Israel, God has physically begotten as the first one in his line, but that word is being used to convey some truth about the relationship that exists between God and his people here. But then that same word is used to contrast with what God is going to do to Pharaoh. Like, you treat my firstborn this way, there are going to be consequences for your firstborn. And so intentionally showing a similarity in terms of the relationship between God and man as between a physical father and a physical son. And so as much as we don't want to overread things from the nature that we have in human relationships into what is true about God, God is intentionally establishing a parallel here, right? These aren't different words. These are intended to be understood connected with one another. If we move forward again in history, we see this concept of son sort of reach another point when we get to 2 Samuel chapter 7. When your days are complete, this is speaking to David when he wanted to build a temple, a house for God. When your days are complete and you lie down with your fathers, I will raise up your descendant after you, who will come forth from you, and I will establish his kingdom. He shall build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. I will be a father to him, and he will be a son to me. When he commits iniquity, I will correct him with the rod of men and the strokes of the sons of men. But my loving kindness shall not depart from him, as I took it away from Saul, whom I removed from before you. Your house and your kingdom shall endure before me forever. Your throne shall be established forever. So a couple of things to consider here. One is, what do we see about how the terms son and father are being used, and what might be different from what we've seen before? And also, what other ideas then are connected with it here in the text? Okay, Bernie?
Intermixing here because someone talking about descendants that they commit iniquity issue, but he also talks about a kingdom, a forever kingdom.
Absolutely.
So he's referring to Christ from the line there, that's the Son of God, but at the same time he's also talking about sons in the line of David, who are regular men that have flaws just like anybody else.
Need to be corrected for iniquity.
It's got parallels running in here.
Yeah, so I think there's a little bit of a type and shadow aspect here where you see, well, what's immediately in view is Solomon, but because, well, Solomon needs some correction, you know, that comes on later in the story, but ultimately having an eternal kingdom, does Solomon himself satisfy what God is intending there? We'll have to look a bit further forward to see who Solomon is picturing, what this relationship is ultimately about. Any thoughts on sort of new terminology? That is the way son used any differently here from what we've seen before?
Now it's in the realm of political, where now we have not just a descendant and descendant and descendant, but someone else who's taking the throne.
Yes.
Is now considered a son.
Yes.
That's more of a political implication.
Yes, I think that somewhat connects back with what we saw all the way back in Genesis 1 with having rule and having dominion, that the way that God begets someone in his image who has rule, well, then we go a little bit further forward into this particular nation that is treated differently and is God's son, God's firstborn. And then within the nation, the one who is ruling, God has a unique relationship with that one where he is father and that one is son and that one is ruling over God's firstborn. Sort of another layer of meaning to it here, taking it to a higher point than we've seen before. I think it's also worth seeing the, I will be a father to him and he will be a son to me. For example, when we had seen that Israel is my son, my firstborn, is that an individual use of the language there? Does that mean that each Israelite, that like Moses is going around and saying, oh, well, God has called me individually son, and he is father with respect to me individually? Like, no, it's more of a collective concept there, that as a group, we are God's son, where now it's come to a point where there's an individual aspect to it. Yeah.
It makes sense just looking at some of Paul's letters where he's saying that not all who are of Israel are actually like the sons of Abraham. And even Jesus alludes to that when he says that if you were truly sons of Abraham, you would listen to me.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so that makes sense that it's more of that collective, almost a title in one sense that comes with being a part of Israel, but not necessarily applied to any individual.
Yeah. In there, it's a bit of an exceptional thing. Like, not, we're looking at a bunch of passages here, but this isn't obviously all of them. The much more common usage would just be like earthly father and earthly son, and to have Israel, even as a collective, called God's son is a bit of exceptional terminology in somewhat exalted language compared with sort of the everyday normal way that you would see things referred to in the scriptures. The same things that we see about David in 2 Samuel come up again and again and again. This theme is emphasized, and so it seems to have a whole lot of importance to the biblical writers for how much they emphasize emphasize this. I will be a father to him, he will be a son to me, coming up again and again and again. But even with all of that terminology where God is calling this one individually, my son, I'm a father to him, when we see Solomon building the temple and praying to God, what kind of language does he use when he talks to God? Well, it's things like Lord Yahweh, and the highest heavens can't contain you, and we are your people, God and people, or your servant David. Even though God has said about him, I will be a father to him and he will be a son to me, Solomon isn't, as far as I could see there, addressing God as father individually. He sort of doesn't presume on that relationship, but the terms of God as creator and Lord, and that we're your servants, like this is the fundamental understanding. And so again, we don't want to read too much of our own understanding that comes later of God and his people and how we relate to him, and think that that was always the way that it was back here, but sort of see it for what it is that, no, this is somewhat exceptional terminology to be referred to in this exalted language as God's son, as the one who sort of represents him over his people, isn't something that Solomon presumes upon.
To the term Abba, Father, because that is much more like child and father. It's very gentle and loving and innocent in a way. So you talked about, I guess, how he's not thinking of God as his father so much.
Yeah.
He's thinking of him as Lord. So where does that concept come in, Abba, Father?
No, that's a good question. I think we'll sort of see as we go through the rest of the Old Testament passages that, does this ever come up in the Old Testament is actually, I think, the question I would end up asking there, or is this something that we have to wait and see what it is that we have revealed to us in the time of Jesus and who he is, and on that basis there's a new understanding. So yeah, I think that's...
So maybe it's a New Testament understanding.
Yeah, I think there's a deeper understanding we get with the New Testament, sort of seeing that progress over time, that we begin with the idea that God is creator and he is Lord, and now he does treat this one people specially as his own, and this one who is his representative over his people, there is a unique relationship, but that's kind of as far as things go, and going much beyond that waits further revelation so that we see more about who God is in what he does in the New Testament. Moving on to the Psalms, talking about the same ideas here of the Davidic king. Why are the nations in an uproar and the peoples devising a vain thing? The kings of the earth take their stand again, and the rulers take counsel together against Yahweh and against his anointed, saying, let us tear their fetters apart and cast away their cords from us. He who sits in the heavens laughs. The Lord scoffs at them. Then he will speak to them in his anger and terrify them in his fury, saying, but as for me, I have installed my king upon Zion, my holy mountain. I will surely tell of the decree of Yahweh. He said to me, you are my son. Today I have begotten you. Ask of me, and I will surely give the nations as your inheritance, and the very ends of the earth as your possession. There are more psalms, so we'll kind of keep on going here, but just worth noticing the you are my son directly connected with this idea of the Davidic king and how far it goes in terms of Zion, sort of the heavenly term for what this is, that the earthly Jerusalem corresponds to what God is doing, and with almost a grander scale as you see the nations being brought in as the possession and not the focus even just on the one particular people. Or then moving on to Psalm 45, my heart overflows with a good theme. I will address my verses to the king. My tongue is the pen of a ready writer. You are fairer than the sons of men. Grace is poured upon your lips. Therefore God has blessed you forever. Gird your sword on your thigh, O mighty one, in your splendor and your majesty. And in your majesty ride on victoriously for the cause of truth and meekness and righteousness. Let your right hand teach you awesome things. Your arrows are sharp, the peoples fall under you. Your arrows are in the heart of the king's enemies. Your throne, O God, is forever and ever. A scepter of uprightness is the scepter of your kingdom. You have loved righteousness and hated wickedness. Therefore, God, your God, has anointed you with the oil of joy above your fellows. This one is a little bit interesting in that it's somewhat puzzling on a first read here, in that, well, we're talking something addressed to the king, and this appears to be a human king because later it says, God, your God has anointed you. So that wouldn't be talking to God because this person is anointed by God, his God. But then right before that, it says, your throne, O God, is forever and ever. As in, there doesn't appear to be a change in person here, and so what does it mean to have these verses addressed to the king, whom God, his God, has anointed, and it to say, your throne, O God, is forever and ever? Like, that's getting to be really exalted language and not the norm of scriptures here to refer to this Davidic king, this son to come in that kind of language. And so this is a little bit puzzling, and I think we'll see later on how to resolve the odd terminology that might sort of strike us as unexpected here. Moving to Psalm 110, Yahweh says to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies a footstool for your feet. Yahweh will stretch forth your strong scepter from Zion, saying, rule in the midst of your enemies. So just again, another use of this idea of the one who is the Davidic king, David's son, yet somehow here David's Lord is this ruler, and that God has something that he's intending to do, and the language gets pretty exalted here where even David would refer to him as my Lord. Now going to the time of the prophets and the hope that the people have as things are sort of going from bad to worse, moving on to exile. Isaiah chapter 9, starting in verse 6. For a child will be born to us, a son will be given to us, and the government will rest on his shoulders, and his name will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Eternal Father, Prince of Peace. There will be no end to the increase of his government or of peace on the throne of David and over his kingdom, to establish it and to uphold it with justice and righteousness from then on and forevermore. The zeal of Yahweh of hosts will accomplish this. And so seeing here the idea of a promised son, which we've seen before, that the language gets to the point of calling him mighty God, or he's so identified with God that you can use the term eternal father, and that accurately conveys an understanding of who he is, linking to the throne of David and to his government and reigning eternally. Like, all of these ideas are starting to come together in this hope for what is to come, because things are not going well for the people at the time. Or then Isaiah 43, we'll just read a little bit of the language here. I'll bring your offspring from the east and gather you from the west, or a little bit later on, bring my sons from afar and my daughters from the ends of the earth, everyone who is called by my name, and whom I have created for my glory, whom I have formed, even whom I have made. Any thoughts here on the use of father-son-like language and how this is similar or different to what we've seen before? Yeah.
I see the same pattern as in the past, is where God's establishing his authority. I will. And he's the one that's orchestrating all the events.
Yeah, there's definitely authority here. And you see that some come up in the creating and the naming, and that is connected with this, my sons and my daughters. There's an authority that goes there. Yeah. Yeah, Bernie?
He has a certain people that are his, and he is going to protect them, and he's also going to lead them.
Yeah, it's interesting.
Sons and daughters, but they're descendants, but they're not necessarily descendants of any particular person, they're descendants of God.
Yeah, it's my sons and my daughters. It links with creation, but it doesn't seem to be referring to everyone in creation either. Yeah. Ishri?
Yeah, it's clear that he says, whom I have called by my name. So he adds something here to calling.
Specificity.
Yes.
Yeah.
Will you please explain the eternal Father phrase more? I didn't understand what you meant by that.
Yeah, so just that the term eternal Father being used, we don't entirely see it explained there in that passage, but we see that there's this hope of this one to come who is so identified with God that to refer to him as mighty God or as eternal Father is not incorrect, that this child will be born to us, this son will be given to us. We expect something great here, and it's not fully explained what it is, but it's sort of beyond our understanding at this point in redemptive history of how grand the Son will be. Yeah.
Well, I think in the New Testament, Jesus does say, when the disciples asked, well, show us the Father.
Yes.
He said, well, have I been with you all this time and you haven't seen me? So he is referring to himself.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, that we will get in just a moment into the New Testament and start to see how these ideas of Father and Son come to a head in Jesus. And it makes a whole lot more sense once you see, well, how could there be one who's a child, who's a son, who you would call Eternal Father? That makes no sense until you see the one who it is. Yeah, Bernie.
Later he says, you talk about David, and he says in Psalms, the Lord said to my Lord.
Mm-hmm.
So therefore it's like, how can he be his son? He's his Lord.
Yeah, there are some puzzling passages here. We're at this point in redemptive history made to think and not given all the answers, but we have this hope and expectation of something to come that isn't fully revealed to us yet. We see a similar thing coming up in Hosea where my people and sons of the living God are used of the people who are not my people because of the way that they're going into exile. And then finally, for the Old Testament in Malachi, do we not all have one Father? Has not one God created us? Any thoughts on how the term Father is being used here?
Well, I mean, if you look at it, ultimately God's our Father, because he created us, but not everybody is been named by God as being part of his we're all created by God, but yet we're not all called by God.
Yeah. I think seeing here that God as Father by creation is true in a broad sense, but it's a different thing from God as Father of his people, or God as Father of the Davidic king, or this child who will be born to us, a son will be given to us, or the sons of God and angels. These are different understandings, and not sort of mixing them all together is important. Yeah.
In the genealogy that Seth is going to be preaching about this morning, it goes all the way back to Adam, and then it goes back to God.
Yes. We'll get there in just a moment, Lord willing. Yeah, that's a great point. So Luke, then, we start seeing from the very beginning that Jesus is this Son who will be born, will be called the Son of the Most High, will have the throne of his father David and reign, and his kingdom will have no end. Like now we're getting to it, right, where all of these things are coming together, and there's no ambiguity here about who is the one who will fulfill all of these things that we have been leading up to in terms of Father and Son. Or then Luke chapter 2, the kind of a play on the terms with parents where Jesus' mother says to him, "Son, why have you treated us this way? Your father and I were." And then Jesus responds, "Didn't you know I had to be in my Father's house?" And so, well, your father and I were in, my Father's house. And there's an idea of fatherhood that Jesus has with respect to God that is more significant than the idea of fatherhood he has with respect to Joseph. Or then, as Elle was mentioning, in Luke chapter 3, Jesus at his baptism, a voice comes down from heaven and says, "You are my beloved Son." And then the very next verse, we get into the genealogy of this beloved son, as he was supposed to be the son of Joseph, the son of Eli, and it goes on, son of, gets all the way to son of Enosh, son of Seth, son of Adam, the son of God. Now, this is interesting here. What terminology do we see that is sort of a new for the first time here with respect to son and historical characters? Brennan?
Well, we get the idea of the progression all the way back, but then at the very beginning, it's like there's God started. He's the father of all these sons, and then the Son of God being Jesus.
Yes.
He's a direct.
So, my beloved Son between God and Jesus. Now follow Jesus' genealogy back, and you get back to son of Adam, son of God. And so, there's God to Jesus, Father and Son, and then also Jesus all the way back up. Through Adam to God, there's a father-son relationship, and for the first time, we see Adam referred to as Son of God. Now, Now, this is not something that we had seen back in Genesis 1, right? There was no father-son terminology there, but now with this new light, we can go back and see a little bit more there than we might have seen the first time. But significantly, this is only after we've had explained to us who the Son is, this beloved Son. Then we can see Adam as a son of God, only after first seeing more clearly who Jesus is as the Son of God. Because otherwise, if we'd seen Adam as the Son of God from the beginning, might we have gotten some misunderstanding here where Adam is the Son of God and Jesus is the Son of God, so Jesus and Adam are brothers, and like this is sounds like starting a new cult here kind of thing, right? Like this isn't the kind of understanding that we have from the scriptures. But if we first see Jesus as the Son of God, then we can see something of Adam's relationship to God as having a father-son aspect to it, but not the same way that Jesus does. Yeah, Al.
But I guess there's also a genealogy of the non-elect too.
Yeah, there are genealogies throughout the scriptures.
It never speaks to, but it's there, obviously.
Al, yeah.
As far as Joseph being the son of Christ, of Jesus, he really wasn't his son.
Right, as was supposed.
This particular genealogy goes to the legal implications.
Yes. He inherited through Joseph.
Yeah, it was a legal implication because genetically he was not.
Yeah, absolutely. And it makes that point with the as was supposed phrasing here in the text. Yeah.
Well, wait a minute, didn't he had some of Mary's genetics, didn't he?
Yeah. Yeah, but this was going through Joseph specifically. And this is where we are in Luke for later on this morning, so I'll let Seth get more into the genealogy aspects of it. Just sort of to point out here that aspect of son that comes up in a couple of ways. If we look then at throughout the New Testament, just looking here how the terminology gets used, Jesus talks about my Father and the Son and the Father. Now we're getting some new language here that's getting really specific, right? Like, have we seen God referred to as the Father in this way before, or the Son in my Father? And then what do the Jews think when Jesus starts to use this language, my Father is working and I am working? Well, they say, you're making yourself to be equal with God to refer to God in that way. This is not how we've always been referring to God. You're doing something extraordinary and unique in how you're talking about the relationship that you have with God. Now, this we might miss a little bit if we start with a contemporary understanding of Father and Son and think, well, God is, the universal fatherhood of God and universal brotherhood of men, and this is completely unsurprising. And no, to the people of his day, there's something that Jesus is claiming here that is surprising and is saying something unique about his relationship with God that isn't the way that the people of God have been talking about God all along is their normal terminology. And again, seeing here a link that isn't just about the physical ancestry, but about the nature of what the Son does and what the Father does. Jesus says that the Son can do nothing of himself unless it's something he sees the Father doing. For whatever the Father does, these things the Son does in like manner. And so the family resemblance being seen in their works. Or this terminology almost reaches a climax in Matthew 28, where we see that if we're talking about God and being baptized as a believer, it's baptized in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit. Like, we've reached a point here where, like, this Son is different from all other understandings of Son, right? This is the Father and the Son, and nothing else is the same as that. So then some of these themes starting to come together from what we've seen earlier as we go through the New Testament in Romans chapter 1. Paul, a bondservant of Jesus Christ, called as an apostle, set forth for the gospel of God, which he promised beforehand through his prophets in the Holy Scriptures concerning his Son, who was born of a descendant of David according to the flesh, who is declared the Son of God with power by the resurrection from the dead, according to the Spirit of holiness, Jesus Christ our Lord. So again, no misunderstanding here that Jesus is the one who fulfills these ideas of a promised Son of David and the one who is to accomplish God's purposes. Or then in Colossians chapter 1, for he rescued us from the domain of darkness and transferred us to the kingdom of his beloved Son, in whom we have redemption, the forgiveness of sins. He is the image of God, the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. For by him all things were created, both in the heavens and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities, all things have been created through him and for him. He is before all things, and in him all things hold together. He is also the head of the body, the church, and he is the beginning, the firstborn from the dead, so that he himself will come to have first place in everything, for it was the Father's good pleasure for all the fullness to dwell in him. So what are some ideas that we're seeing here in Colossians connected with Son? Yeah.
Matter of preeminence. Is that right?
Protocols?
So firstborn here, I think, is saying that this isn't just any son. This is the one who will inherit. This is the heir. This is the unique one, my beloved son. I think it's connecting back with some of those ideas, yeah.
Protocols?
I'd have to double check.
I think that's what it means.
Well, I think it's interesting because a couple of these ones we've gone through before, it talks about Jesus being the Son of God, being, equal with God. At the same time, if you go back to Genesis, it's like, then it said, let us make God in our image. So they already had that idea that there was a multiplicity in Godhead, but not the detail. Now we have the detail of who the Godhead is, the Father, Son, and the Spirit.
There was one who is there creating with the Father. Yeah.
So they're all equal with God because they're all God.
Yeah. And here also linking with the terminology image of God, that Adam was created in the image of God, but Jesus is the image of the invisible God, and there's a whole new level of understanding there as well. Yeah. And then perhaps my favorite passage on this one, Hebrews chapter 1. God, after he spoke long ago to the fathers and the prophets, in many portions and in many ways, in these last days has spoken to us in his Son, whom he appointed heir of all things, through whom also he made the world. And he is the radiance of his glory and the exact representation of his nature, and upholds all things by the word of his power. When he had made purification of sins, he sat down at the right hand of the Majesty on high, having become as much better than the angels as he has inherited a more excellent name than they. For to which of the angels did he ever say, "You are my son, today I have begotten you"? And again, "I will be a father to him, and he shall be a son to me." And when he again brings the firstborn into the world, he says, "And let all the angels of God worship him." And of the angels, he says, "Who makes his angels winds and his ministers a flame of fire." But of the Son, he says, "Your throne, O God, is forever and ever. And the righteous scepter is the scepter of his kingdom. You have loved righteousness and hated lawlessness. Therefore, God, your God, has anointed you with the oil of gladness above your companions. And you, Lord, in the beginning laid the foundation of the earth, and the heavens are the work of your hands. They will perish, but you remain. And they all will become old like a garment, and like a mantle you will roll them up. Like a garment they will also be changed. But you are the same, and your years will not come to an end. But to which of the angels has he ever said, "Sit at my right hand until I make your enemies a footstool for your feet"? So what are things that we see coming together with the idea of sonship here in Hebrews 1?
He's the absolute creator, the ruler and owner of everything that exists.
Yeah.
So he has dominion above anything else that there is. The angels, powerful as they are not even comparable to them.
Yeah, this kind of goes all the way back to what we were seeing in Genesis. And so these angels who might be called sons of God, that's not the same as "You are my son, today I've begotten you." Don't misunderstand that all these uses of son mean the same thing. The Hebrew says otherwise. And going back to Adam, that he is the one who has the rule and dominion, that everything that Adam was to be, Jesus is and more. That this Son of God who does do the works of his Father and was present in creation and has always been doing the works of his Father, the one who has his Father's love and bears his image, like all of these things come together and are seen to come to completion in Christ. Yeah, sure.
One fascinating part of the Pauline epistles is Paul's emphasis on how new creations in Christ, saints, are going to be one with God and be brothers of Him. And so there's a way in which we now have the opportunity to see all these lessons of Scripture imported to us, and it's almost unbelievable to think that we could be new creations in Christ. When we look at our human bodies, we say, how can this be? And yet, I feel kind of like Mary did when the angel was saying, you're going to have a son without a husband, and all of a sudden she says, how can these things be?
Yeah, it's amazing stuff. Yeah, Sheree?
Yeah, think one of the most stunning passages in the previous passage, in Hebrews, if you can read that, in the fourth one, but of the Son, he refers to Yahweh, says, your throne, O God, forever and ever. And this points to the uniqueness of the Son, and that his sonship is totally different from any kind of other sonship as
Absolutely.
well. So this is a striking statement that Yahweh says about the Son.
Yeah. And we hear from Hebrews that it is Jesus being referred to, your throne, O God, that it wasn't changing who was being talked to, that is this king all along, this Davidic king who ultimately is God's son in a way that's completely different from all others. Yeah.
And this is coming at me pretty quick. I came from another church, and I'm just here at this church for the second Sunday, so bear with me if I get something wrong. You may not have covered this. In verse 9 here, you have loved righteousness and hated lawlessness. Therefore, God, your God, has anointed you. Very, very clearly speaks to Jesus as God.
It's Jesus as God.
Interesting passage.
Yeah, particularly God, Jesus is God, has anointed him, and he is referred to as your throne of God, just a few verses earlier. So yeah, no mistaking the nature of this one. And then finally, Revelation 1, we see things come together that Jesus is the firstborn of the dead, ruler of the kings of the earth, that he's made us to be a kingdom priest to his God and Father, to him be the glory and the dominion forever. So Genesis to Revelation, this idea of sonship developing and then focusing on Jesus, the one who is the Son, the one who has dominion. All kingship and rule comes under him. He is the image of the invisible God. Everything that God has taught us about Father and Son being summed up in Jesus. Now, this is not the last thing that we'll hear on Father and Sonship, as Sherman was alluding to earlier. There's more that the Scriptures have to say that what happens through Jesus, and Lord willing, we'll look at that next week, but we can see here that starting at the beginning, we have Adam, Father and Son. God forms Adam and his father by virtue of creation. That image transfers on to Seth. We see that there is a promised son that Abraham is waiting for, where God is going to do something in particular with blessing, that there is this people of God who is being treated as God's son uniquely, that there is within that people this Davidic king who is God's son, and extremely exalted language gets used of him, and then going on into the New Testament that this promised son and king who will reign has arrived, and Jesus is the one for whom we are waiting, and all of the hope and expectation that has been building around this idea is fulfilled in him. Yeah, Bernie?
The other issue is that a number of these passages talk about his kingdom being forever, and since no son of a human being lives forever, in that respect, Jesus
he reigns forever.
Reigns forever, so he has the control.
Yeah, he has life and he reigns. Well, let's pray together. Father, thank you for your Son, Jesus Christ. Thank you for what you have taught us about yourself. Thank you that you have not left us alone, but that you have revealed who you are, that we can believe what it is true and relate to you as you truly are. We ask that you would do good to us, that we would love you and keep your commands, and that we would understand more of the truth and live according to it. Amen. You're dismissed.